Hello and welcome to part 3 of the series where we're building this lovely little book stand thing. In this video, we're going to focus on nesting the little brackets on the back of the frame into component 2 and ready to accept the little arm leg thing that's going to be on the back of it. So, let's go. Right, so before we glue anything together, we need to assemble the bridle joint thing that's on component 2, which is this one. So I'll show you how to do that now. Getting close. Right, so in order to construct this bridle joint thing that's going on here, what I want to do is get 2 little components like this and nest them into the side of it. So you can see that that's going to create a bridle joint. The problem is, if I keep the components as they've come from the DIY supplier here, it means that the gap between them is going to be very thin, which means that the stand that holds up the frame is going to have to be very thin as well and not provide much strength. So ideally what I want to do here is plane these down to a certain thickness to allow this to sit snugly between them. In fact, what I might do is actually make the fit between them a little bit too tight, and then I can take 1 or 2 passes off here with a plane and really snug it up between them to make a perfect fit. So with a quick bit of maths, you can work out how much you need to plane these down by. So these components are meant to be 32, but they're actually 31 millimeters. This component here is about 11.5 millimeters, let's say. So let's call that 11, that one 31. So if you take 11 away from 31, that means that you're left with 20, which means you've got 10 millimeters either side, meaning I need to plane these little bits down to 10 millimeters. The problem is that planing little components like that down to 10 millimeters is a little bit of a nightmare trying to balance your plane on it and work down to certain sizes. So instead what I'll do is get a long component like this, cut it completely oversized, plane it down to 10 millimeters, and then I can cut it to size after that. So this one, you can see I've got a face side on the back, and I'm just going to scratch around it with a marking gauge on all 4 sides, so I've got something to work to. Not going to lie, I did already do this because I forgot to turn on the camera on my last shot, which is a bit annoying. There we go. So there's a line to work to, and I can take it to the tail vise now. Right, and with a nice finely set plane, I can just skim that over the top and plane down to those lines. Right, and then as you approach the end, you'll get these like little stringy bits break off, and that is the material breaking off above the marking gauge line that you've scratched on the edge here. So as soon as you start seeing these little wispy bits breaking off, it means that you're pretty much there. You just got to do 1, 2 more passes, and then you are down to thickness. So now let's cut these to size. So I've got a shooting board here, and just going to square off the end grain on it. Do that on that side. So now both ends are square, and I can just cut off a little bit on each end. What I need to do now is just work out how long they actually need to be. Right, and then square marking from the face edge, I'm going to mark the length of these components. Then cut them just over size. And again, when you're planing these down, you want them to be exactly the same size. So I'll work back to that line to start with. And once they look to be about a similar length, I'll get them together and then just check that the ends actually sit flush. Oops, that one's a little bit longer still. Cool, perfect length. Now let's just check that fit. So if they were to sit on there, that is the component of normal size. So if I squeeze them together, yeah, that's pretty much perfect. These outside components are overhanging this component by about 0.5 millimeter. So by the time I get those nested in at their proper depth, it's going to be a little bit too tight for that middle component, and then I can plane it down to fit. So now let's get the like hinge thingy worked out. So these components are about 31 millimeters, which makes it about 15.5 till the midway point. So let's try that. Set a marking gauge to 15.5 and just give a little mark in the middle there, and a little mark from the other side. If they meet up, it means that you've hit it dead on in the center. Those haven't. I need to extend it a bit more. Okay, so now that marking gauge is hitting the middle of that component from both sides, which is good. So now I can put a mark down one face like that and a mark in from the end grain, and that's going to give me a set of crosshairs on there. And then I can do the same on the other component as well. So a set of crosshairs there, and then I'm just going to put a little pencil mark in the middle just so I can properly see them. And from there I'm going to get a set of dividers. Obviously you could use something like a standard compass from here with a pencil on the end of it. What we're going to do here is poke one of them into the crosshairs and the other one right to the edge of the component, and then scratch a semicircle all the way around the outside of the component. And that's going to give us a nice little round to work to, so same on here. Okay, and with both those little components already done, we can get the shooting board back out and cut to size the stand for the back. We're going to make one end of it nice and square. There we go. And then with the same setting on the marking gauge, we'll scratch some crosshairs into the end, exactly as we did in the smaller components, and then get our dividers and scratch a semicircle into the end as well. There we go. So the reason we've left this oversized is so that we can cut it to its final length once we work out the exact tilt that we want our frame to be. Obviously the top of this is going to be adjustable, but you need to have it cut to a certain size so that it has a good amount of adjustment in it. Right, so now we're going to nest these components into component 2, and look, I've stolen a pencil from Screwfix. I'm such a criminal. God, how could I? Oh dear. So we're going to measure down 30 millimeters or so, I reckon, and then I'm going to square a line across with a knife. So put a knife into that pencil mark, knife from the face side, or face edge, sorry, and lightly score that across the front. You don't want to do it too deep here. Now I'll flip the component round. I'm going to put the knife back into that knife line, put the square up to it so it butts up against it, component up against the square, take away the square, and then I can scratch another marking line in there. So that's going to give me the exact width of these components, and then I can square these lines down the sides as well. So square in from the face edge, put the knife into the edge of that line there, and scratch it back. And these ones you can afford to make a little bit deeper. Cool, and then along the back as well, again nice and shallow here. There we go, so we've got 2 lines scratched around that component at the exact same width as these components. The next thing I need to do is mark out how far in these need to be nested. So to do that, I'm going to get to the marking gauge, set that to the thickness of these components. I'm going to make this spot on, so lock that down. And then you can put a marking gauge line between these lines that you scratched on component 2. So that's it on the front and on the back. Now, if you really wanted, you can make this a little dovetailed joint sort of thing if you wanted. I'm just going to nest it straight in like that, but, you know, dovetail on there. Might look nice if you fancy it. And of course, before we do anything else, mark the bloody waist. Okay, let's cut that out. Right, and then I'm going to cut about 1 millimeter away from that line so I can tidy it up with a chisel afterwards. Then I'll do one in the middle just to help weaken that material. Okay, and then flip it over, do exactly the same. And then stick it flat on the desk and we can chisel out this waist here. So just light taps and you're going to remove it like that. Just be very careful when you're doing this because pine isn't the nicest one to split off. Well, I mean, it's easy to split off, but it doesn't always split in the direction that's intended. So don't take off too much at this point. You could also coping saw out the waist if you weren't as lazy as me. But basically the key to this is doing light controlled taps, not one big whack. And here I'm only working to halfway through the component. I'm not smashing all the way through. So if I work from either side, it means that I'm not going to go below that marking gauge line. Okay, so that's most of that cleared out, so now I can stick it back in the vise like that, and then just remove any little humps and bumps that are in the bottom of that. And again, only working to halfway here. If I need to go from the other side, I'm going to flip it around and go it like that. Okay, now let's chisel down these walls. Right, now with the lovely macro lens, oh, I love this thing. So here, cut about 1 millimeter away from the line, so I'm going to take it down to 0.5 millimeter. So chisel halfway through, and remove the bulk of the waist. And I'm not going to whack it too hard here because, like I learned earlier, if you hit it too hard, it's going to put a horrible little dent in the bottom corner there. So it doesn't happen too much in hardwood, but softwood, very easy to do and very apparent at the end. So now I'm pretty close to that line, chisel into the marking gauge line and tap it vertical. So most of the material's been removed and now I'm into the marking gauge line. Right, and now moment of truth. So That's the component 2, so this one can cram in there, get it nice and tight, and this one in there as well. Okay, so they are nested in there quite nicely, and now ideally this one should, there you go, so it just goes in there, but it is pushing the components out ever so slightly at the moment, which is good because it means that once we compress those in, we can then plane this side once or twice and get a perfect fit between them. So before gluing any of this in, what I'm going to do is sand these inside faces, sand these components, because once you get stuff glued together, it's difficult to get between them. It's going to be difficult to get under here, for example. So do that all first. So all I've got here is a block of offcut timber, some 180 grit sandpaper, wrap it round it, wait for that truck to pass outside. Sounded like a bloody bulldozer. Right. The other thing to look out for here is just make sure you don't attack these corners too much or add any sort of weird round over to them, because again, that's going to affect the fit of the joint. Okay, and there we go, that's that side done. So I'm just going to work around my way on all these components. Right, now I'm on these outside components here. So obviously if we sand up this edge and go right to the end of the dovetail here, that's going to affect the joint. So just make sure you really stop up right up against that corner there. So I'm going to get the sandpaper flush with the end of the block and just nibble away at it up there. There you go, that'll be all that needs. And then down here as well. Cool, and now we'll just work in the middle, making sure not to hit those edges. And the same goes for the arrasing, just stop it right up against that shoulder line there. Don't go any further. Right, so now we're on the longer components. So again, don't need to worry about the top because we can get access to that after it's glued up. It's these inside faces that we need to focus on. But again, you don't want to do too much because it's going to start affecting the dovetail joints on the shoulders here. So you probably just want to skip straight to 180 grit here if I were you, and just give it a light skim over. Right, and now before sanding these little nubby components that are making the bridle joint out the back, we need to shape the semicircle thing on there. So if you have a disc sander or something like that, lovely, that'll make it nice and easy. But if you only have hand tools, you're going to need some sort of rasp type thing. So this is a microplane rasp, which comes in various curvatures, various coarseness, fineness, don't know what I'm saying, but you can get them in various grades. That's the word I was looking for, grades. So I'm going to use that to shape the semicircle in here, and then I'll just sand the edges to make it nice and smooth. So clamp at 45 degrees and just work our way down to that semicircle. Right, so it's a fiddly little job, but I am pretty much getting there towards the end. It's not looking too bad. Just working down to that line as carefully as you can. Cool. That's probably looking semicircular enough, I reckon. So I've just finished rounding over the end of the stand, and now I can just clean up the end of it with sandpaper and get rid of any of those small undulations. So starting with 120 grit here, and then I'm going to finish it off with 180. Right, so these are all sanded nice and smooth now, the ends are nice and round, and now we need to drill the holes through them. So this you want to get as plumb as possible, that's the word I was looking for. So if you've got a drill press, ideal, that would be lovely. But if you've just got a hand drill like this is how I would go about it. So stand with your eyesight looking down one of the holes like this, so we'll do this one first, with it going this way. And then when you put the drill into that little pokey bit, you can see if it's tilting left or right. What you can't properly see is if it's tilting away or towards you. So to get rid of that, tilt this 90 degrees, so then I can get this one lined up, and now I can see if it's tilting this way. And then I'm going to get a square and stick that on the back edge here, and I'm going to line it up with the drill bit, and then lean the drill back until it taps it. So now I'm just sighting down to make sure it is square this way, which it now is, or it looks like it. Hold the drill there, and go. There we go. So that is through there, and now we can do the same on these smaller components. Then what I can do is get component 2, and then I can stick the little notchy bit in either side. That's the tight one. Get an M6 bolt through one side, and then see if I can get the other one onto there. And then just make sure the round over on there allows it to move a full 180 degrees, which it does. Yeah, it's ready to be glued up, I think. So firstly, what I'm going to do is glue these onto component 2. We're going to let that dry and then we'll glue that to the rest of the frame. And then we don't have a clamp going across here when, you know, it's just going to be too much clamping going on and provide too much stress on the frame. So we'll do this separately for now. I'm just going to use a standard Titebond 3 for this. So little dab in there and a little dab in there. So with these hinge things, I've got a rough side on them and I've got a smooth side. I'm going to put them in with the rough side out so then I can easily clean it up later on. Make sure you're obviously sticking them going back from the face side. You don't want them sticking forward like this because that's the front of the frame. And one thing to do here to make sure these holes don't glue out of a line is get yourself the M6 bolt and then just pop them through both of those components and then clamp that in place like that. So then you can be sure that they are in perfect alignment with one another. Ooh. What happened there? Oh dear. Smaller clamp. Cool. And then just make sure that they're sitting flush with the front of the frame as well, so it minimises the amount of cleanup you have to do. Lovely. So now that can still move freely in there. I'm just going to leave it in there just in case. The only thing you've got to do now is just make sure you've got no glue in those inside corners there. Right, now with that all dried up, I can start flushing it all off. So little block plane or something similar for this. Okay, cool, and now we'll just sand it. Right, and then to glue this up, we're just going to do a quick dry fit first. Let me know what you think of the new camera angle as well, by the way, I quite like it. Little overhead view. Right, so basically I'm going to put 4 clamps on this and I'm not going to put them directly over the dovetails because if the end grain is sitting proud, it means that the only part that you're actually putting pressure on is this component here. You're not pressing these components into the shoulders of that one. So by offsetting the clamps a little bit to the outside, it means that you're going to be pressing the correct component into these uprights. And I'm really not cranking these around that much. The joints don't need a lot of pressure and this material is obviously quite soft as I've experienced throughout this project. So I don't want to be denting it with cramps or anything like that. So just a little nip up. As soon as those joints close up, that's when I know I've got enough. And then I'll use a little cramp like this to press the dovetails into their sockets. Looks pretty good, so I've got no gaps along the shoulder lines here. Let's flip it over real careful. Lovely. Doesn't seem to be any issues with that, so let's do that again, but with actual glue. Right, so I've got it laid out how it's due to be glued together, so just a little bit of glue in each of the bottom of the sockets. I mean, we all know how a glue up goes. Not too much here, just make sure you've got glue on all the long grain components and a little bit on these end grain walls because you might as well. Right, so that's all the sockets sorted, and now we can do a little bit on these front shoulders on the dovetails, because again, we might as well. People always say never to glue end grain because wood is basically like loads of straws, and as soon as you put glue on there, it just soaks into it. And while that might be true to an extent, you might as well do it because it does fill up some tiny gaps if there are any. I don't know, I just think it's a good thing to do. You have that gluing face, you might as well use it to its advantage. Right, so how was this going? So that is component A. Okay, and then a little bit of water and a wet rag. Okay, and then using a wet rag wrapped around a 6-inch ruler, you can get right into the corners and clean out that glue. Right, and there you go guys, that is it all glued together, ready to go. So I'll leave that for 24 hours or so, and then that'll all be nice and hardened. So all I've got to do now is plane a few of the joints flush, give it a quick sand, maybe apply a stain, and get the stand thing in the back of the bridle joint there. So we'll do that in the next episode. I will see you then.